welcome to Videos from the Ville. I'm Professor Greenewalt, and this is Government 112, State and Local Government. We're going to look at the next subject, which is local government. We're going to see if we can put a lot of the final material together in this presentation on local government. First thing we have to do when we look at local government in the United States is look at what are the types of local government. There's essentially three basic types of local government in America. What are they? First of all would be the commission form of government. The commission form of government is from a horrible natural disaster that occurred in Galveston, Texas in the year 1900. In fact, Erik Larson, the famous author that wrote about the Devil in the White City, about the Columbian Exposition in Chicago at the turn of the 19th century, about the competition between Tesla and Edison to see who would light the World's Fair. Would it be DC or AC? And Tesla won, by the way. But Erik Larson wrote another book about this terrible storm called Isaac's Storm. It was in Galveston, Texas. Galveston was the jewel of the Gulf of Mexico. It was the largest city in Texas. It was the richest city in Texas. But Galveston, Texas was built on a sandbar, and the sandbar was elevated 6 feet above sea level. And we find that we did not have the meteorological tools that we have today. So one day in 1900, the winds picked up and the clouds rolled over, and people gathered by the Gulf of Mexico to see the huge waves. Some jumped in, and much to the horror of the crowds, they looked in the distance, and they saw a 75-foot tidal wave coming towards them. That tidal wave hit Galveston, Texas, like a bombing raid from the Second World War, and it devastated Galveston. 1/3 of the city population was killed, drowned, washed away. And I have a picture here, and you have a picture on your PowerPoint slide of what Galveston, Texas looked like in the aftermath of the storm of 1900. You find that what happened was there were so many individuals killed, and even so many members of city government killed, that what was decided was that they took some of the few survivors of the city council, and they decided to take those surviving members of city council and give them operational control over one or two departments of city government. So you have a fusion of the executive and legislative functions there. You have an elected city council, and city council members then are given operational responsibility over the Department of Health, maybe the schools, maybe the police department, maybe parks and lights, maybe water and sewer, but they're responsible for that. You find that there are very few local governments in our area that use commission form of government. There was one large city that did until about 25 years ago or so. They had used it for much of their history, and it seemed to work well, but people felt that they were behind the times. They formed a city commission that studied it and recommended that they change their form of local government. They did, but there's some now who are questioning if they made a mistake and maybe they should go back. Of course, that local city that used the commission form of government was Lebanon, Pennsylvania. They would elect their city council, and then each member was given control of one department of city government, where they would come in every day and oversee that department. So the commission form of government grew up out of the terrible disaster that occurred in Galveston, Texas in 1900. The second type of local government we find coming out of Stanton, Virginia. In Stanton, Virginia, which was the birthplace of Woodrow Wilson, we find that in 1908, the city manager form of government developed in Stanton, Virginia. Now, the city manager form of government is a form of government in which you have an elected city council. They set the policies for the city, but the city is city's government. Its executive is a full-time, nonpartisan public administration professional. What the city council does is they hire someone to be the city manager, and the city manager is expected to implement the decisions, the programs of the city council, despite their own feelings, and they are simply to serve at the pleasure of the city council. So you find in the South there are many, many city managers, and city manager can be a very good life. You find that several years ago in Richmond, Virginia, the city manager was paid over $200,000 a year. I believe it's been escalated since that time. Now, we find that at the county level, there's a similar form of government, and that's referred to as the county administrator. But in the city level, the local level, it's called a city manager. Okay? So the city manager form of government is the second form of local government we have. And the third form of government is the city council mayor form of government. But when we look at the city council mayor form of government, we have to understand and remember that there are three forms of the city council mayor form of government. You have a weak mayor, you have a strong mayor, and you have a strong mayor with a controller or a chief administrative officer. Let's take a look at the one that developed first, the weak mayor form of government. The weak mayor form of government at the local level came about during the Jacksonian era. In the Jacksonian era, we have this deep distrust of executive power. That's a spin-off from the Revolutionary War, the war against the British in 1812. And you find that you didn't want an executive that was too strong or that could run roughshod over the representatives of the people that would be found in city council. So you have a weak mayor, generally is a figurehead for the city, might be the spokesperson for the city, might get to appoint several officials, may even have a weak veto over the actions of the city council. That's about it. Then the second form of government under city council mayor form of government is the strong mayor. The strong mayor, this is when a mayor is elected and assumes the responsibility for directing all departments of the city government. This came about in the progressive era in the 1880s as we're looking for more effective forms of government, more accountable forms of government. And a strong mayor is easily accountable. He or she is responsible for the actions of all the city departments if they are in charge of overseeing them. The best example, in our Commonwealth, almost a legendary example of a strong mayor, city council form of government, could be found in Harrisburg under Steve Reed. Steve Reed was elected at the beginning of the 1980s, and you find that he served for 28 years, I believe, until he was taking it easy. He didn't think that he had a primary challenge, and in fact, a city councilwoman who challenged him in a primary, she was campaigning hard. She went from door to door. And she was African American, he was Caucasian. She was able to stir a little bit of African American pride, and no one expected her to win, but everyone thought, well, we'll go and give our support to her, and the mayor thought he didn't have anything to worry about, and lo and behold, he lost. But Steve Reed is a great example of a strong mayor, and you can see the huge difference that he made in the city of Harrisburg. Um, when we look at the city of Harrisburg, you find that in 1975, when I left for graduate school, and that summer I worked for the Harrisburg City Bureau of City Planning. You find that the main square is what, 2nd Street and Market, and that particular large square was the centerpiece for the state capitol. And what was it? It was populated by pawn shops, porn shops, and pimps and prostitutes. It was a despicable place to be the show place for the state capitol. One of the first things that Steve Reed did was bring in the Hilton. He tore down a lot of the pawn shops and the consignment stores and the old hotels, the old flop houses, and he brought in the Hilton as a centerpiece for the main square. Then he moved City Hall right across the street and built a brand new City Hall. He brought in Pennsylvania Insurance. He went 1 block south and took the hotel that was there and reconditioned it, rebuilt it, the Crown Plaza. And all of a sudden, Harrisburg has a new and thriving center. He moved a little bit further to the east, and he built the Whitaker Center, which was a show place for entertainment and also a science museum and a civic center, along with a whole shopping area in what's called Strawberry Square. So these were all some of the improvements that he made. He went to City Island. He took this pile of mud in the middle of the Susquehanna River that was only used for overflow parking for state employees, and he managed to make it a recreational jewel for South Central Pennsylvania, putting in a little railroad for children, a miniature golf course. He put in sports fields and brought a minor league baseball team here to Harrisburg, bought a minor league soccer team to Harrisburg. We find that he brought a whole series of little restaurants, little cafe, little snack shops, I should say, that are open in the summertime, and was responsible for leading the effort to locate a paddle wheel boat that was based on the paddle wheel boats that you find in the Mississippi, the pride of the Susquehanna, which is, of course, still there every summer. Every late spring it's launched, and every early fall it's taken out of the Susquehanna. Most of you, I imagine, have ridden the pride of the Susquehanna already. But he's made City Island a wonderful place to be during the summer, and a place where the people of Harrisburg can go to have a great time. He built the American Civil War Museum. Of course, this was an endeavor that I actually was very pessimistic about, and I thought if you want to learn about the Civil War, you're going to go to Gettysburg. But I did forget that the major camp for training Union troops was in Harrisburg, Camp Curtin. And so Harrisburg has a strong connection to the Civil War. And he took the best position in the city, up at Reservoir Park, the highest point in the city, and he built a huge building with a classical architecture, and he scoured the country looking for artifacts of the Civil War. I was very skeptical when I went into the Civil War Museum for the first time, and it turns out, I think, with the exception today of the very recent new center at Gettysburg, the Visitor Center at Gettysburg, exception of that, I believe that the Civil War Museum in Harrisburg is the finest Civil War museum in the country, and there are many to compare it with. So he built that. We find that one of the first things he did was to try to eliminate, but he certainly reduced prostitution and drug dealing up and down 2nd Street and 3rd Street on Thursday and Friday nights. On Thursday and Friday night in the 1970s, Those streets look like something that you might find in Bangkok, Thailand, from the 1960s. You could buy just about anything or have almost any kind of carnal experience one wanted. Steve Reed put a whole slew of Harrisburg policemen in plain clothes, and they began to arrest prostitutes and the clients of the prostitutes. And the clients of the prostitutes, their names, addresses, and occupations appeared in the local newspaper and also on bulletin boards that were large billboards going into and out of Harrisburg. You can just imagine the furor that emerged when a Camp Hill minister was caught soliciting for prostitution. All of a sudden, prostitution, at least on the surface, wasn't and still hasn't been a major problem for Harrisburg. Steve Reed was able to reduce that, along with a whole host of drug dealing was also cut into. We find that Steve Reed, of course, finally, as I said, took an election, a primary election for granted, and was bushwhacked. He was surprised. You find that he had one issue that he had not resolved yet. Maybe if he had had more time in office, he would have, but he hadn't resolved the issue of the Harrisburg incinerator. The Harrisburg incinerator was a way of getting rid of Harrisburg's trash and garbage. We find that it was in desperate need of refinancing and rebuilding. After he lost that his last election, we find that the county became involved, and in fact, the Harrisburg incinerator was refinanced and continues to operate, as far as I know, to this day. Well, the strong mayor form of government is another form of government that we have, a second form. The third and final form of local government is a strong mayor with a chief administrative officer. You have to remember that the mayor, if he or she is doing their job correctly, is a figurehead and has to be everywhere all at once. The mayor is supposed to be at every important funeral, wedding, bar mitzvah, every business opening, that every large civic meeting or activity that occurs in the city, the mayor is supposed to be there. Doesn't give them much time to think about public policy. Doesn't give them much time to do their work. So consequently, you find that in many cities, such as Philadelphia and New York City, that you will have a chief administrative officer. While the mayor is going around representing the city all day long, you'll find that the chief administrative officer is responsible for administering the departments of city government, but reporting directly to the mayor. The mayor doesn't lose accountability, but the mayor has to rely on the chief administrative officer to make the city run. Another name for the chief administrative officer, some cities call this position a controller. If any of you are familiar with that old sitcom called Spin City with Michael J. Fox, this was a situation comedy that he was making just before he came down and was diagnosed with Parkinson's. But he did a fantastic job. Barry Bosworth was the mayor of New York, and he was always going to one business opening or one city meeting or some wedding. And Michael J. Fox was the CAO and was running the city of New York. You find that when Michael J. Fox's health made him step down, he was replaced by whom? He was replaced by Charlie Sheen. You might remember that. So Spin City was actually about the strong mayor form of government with the chief administrative officer. Well, what else must we concern ourselves with in local government? You have to remember that all local governments need, for example, city charters. City charter would be what a constitution is for a national government or a state government. A city charter is for a city government. It sets forth the geographic limits of the city. It sets forth the organization for city government, and it outlines the powers and responsibilities of the city's government. So a city charter will do all those things. Find that city charters for cities such as New York are volumes and volumes long, go into excruciating detail. Well, we also want to look at, for example, what is the largest city in America? Some of you might be surprised. The largest city in terms of geography is, surprisingly, when my wife and I were driving along years and years ago, this would have been back in the 1970s, the late 70s, we went to visit Jacksonville, Florida for the first time. Well, we were probably at least 20 miles outside of town, and we encountered a sign that said, "Welcome to Jacksonville, Florida." It was nowhere in sight. Jacksonville has extended its boundaries for future growth and made it the largest city in America geographically. Well, let's come home here to Pennsylvania and look at local government in Pennsylvania. We said that the state constitution of each state sets forth the local governments that are available and used by that particular state, and so it is with the Pennsylvania Constitution. The Pennsylvania Constitution has established the following local governments. The Pennsylvania Constitution says that there are first class, second class, and third class cities. Now, first, second, and third class cities are based entirely on population. We have one first class city, Philadelphia. We have one second class city, Pittsburgh. So all the cities that we normally think of as being cities, Harrisburg, York, Lancaster, Lebanon, Reading, they are all third class cities. They are all third class cities. In addition to first, second, and third class cities, Pennsylvania Constitution also provides for boroughs. Boroughs, this is a type of local government brought from England. It's a name that's used in England. It's another name for a village or a town, and we find that the name borough is only used in the northeastern part of the United States. We find that there's a borough council. The borough council decides on what the policy will be for the borough. We have a borough mayor. The borough mayor is, again, pretty much like a weak mayor, very much a figurehead. The borough mayor is a spokesperson for the borough and generally has some type of control, supervisory power over the police. But otherwise, the most important person, the most powerful person in the borough is the president of the borough council. Boroughs that are found in our area would include Ephrata, Mountjoy, Palmyra, for example, are all examples of boroughs. Finally, in Pennsylvania, we have townships. Townships are found only in the northeastern part of the United States. We find the number of supervisors that we have in a township depends on the population of the township. Most townships simply have 3 supervisors, and we do not have provisions for a partisan composition. You can have 3 Democrats, you can have 3 Republicans, you can have 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, or 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. So townships, the number of supervisors is set by population, policy is set by the supervisors, and generally the supervisors hire a township manager to run the day-to-day operations of the township. You find that I live in a township, and many of you may live in townships here in Lancaster County. It's interesting, when we go to the south of the Mason-Dixon line, you will have county governments, as we do here at the regional level. We have county governments, right? And within the county, we'll have cities, first class, well, we'll have third class cities, unless we're in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. We might have a third class city, we might have a borough, and the rest of the county is going to be comprised of townships. We find in the South, you'll have a county government and you'll have city governments, and that's it. So if you live in a county and you don't live in a city, such as when I lived in Virginia, I lived in Albemarle County. Now Charlottesville was there. You could live in Charlottesville. You could have lived in Scottsville, for example. But you could have lived in, trying to think of another, you could have lived in Crozet. But if you didn't live in one of the cities, then you lived in the county. And that's where I lived, just outside of Charlottesville. So that's how local government is handled in the South. It's very different. You don't have the townships. You find that in the I will draw this to a close here. If you have questions about local government, particularly local government in Pennsylvania, let me know. I'll be happy to try to address them. Let's see. One last thing. I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. I wanted to talk to you about Cooley's rule versus Dillon's rule. This is this whole discussion, like at the national level, we have this discussion of the powers that are available for the country versus the power for the states. Well, Dillon's rule and Cooley's rule is what are the powers of the state versus the powers of the local government. We find that originally we have Cooley's rule in 1871. Judge Thomas Cooley of Michigan, he believed that the right to local self-government was simply inherent. It was simply there in the nature of democracy. That any group of citizens, any group of houses that were situated together, if they wanted to have their own government, they should be allowed to have their own government, according to Cooley's rule. And Cooley's rule stood until 1911. In 1911, Judge John Dillon, who was an Iowa State Supreme Court justice, he said that all local governments are the creatures. All local governments are the creatures of state government, and if state government wants to abolish any local governments, they may do so at any time. Generally, they won't because of history and just sort of inertia, sort of legacy of those areas. But his contention is if in Harrisburg, the Pennsylvania State Legislature wants to do away with Lancaster County, tomorrow it can do so, and it can be fused with Chester County or can be broken up. If the General Assembly wants to do away with the city of Lancaster, it has the power to do so. That all local governments are the creatures of state government. That's Dillon's rule, and this is the rule that has prevailed in the study of constitutional law. When we look at constitutional law, how it's applied, we find that Dillon's rule has prevailed over Cooley's rule. So I just wanted to make you aware of these two philosophies. There are pictures of Judge John Dillon and Thomas Cooley on your slide. So this will bring our presentation on local government to a close. Again, if you have questions, contact me. I'm happy to try to answer. Okay, I'll be back with another I think for state and local government, this might be I think this is the final presentation for state and local government. Okay, but it's been a unusual semester, hasn't it? One like we'll probably never have again. I'm glad to have you in the class, and if I can ever be of assistance to you in terms of recommendations or in terms of talking about grad schools or internships, don't hesitate to contact me, okay? You guys are a great group of people, and I look forward to seeing you when we go back to normal university operations. Have a great summer.
Done.